apologies if it seems dark in here and if by chance I don't look so good. I just got home from work. I'm tired. 2020 is almost at its end, and today I am talking about the books that I read this year that I really wasn't a fan of. I shouldn't have to say this, but I will anyway. This is all based on my tastes and my personal preferences, and they may clash with yours, and that's okay. So for this, I'm going to start with the books that I rated 2 stars, and then I'll tackle the ones that I rated 1 star. So the first book I'm going to talk about here is Vittorio the Vampire by Anne Rice. This book I was really hoping to like, especially since it was a book that I had already read. It was the very first Anne Rice book I ever read. And I was so very disappointed that it didn't turn out to be as good this time around as it did when I first read it. For a few reasons. I'm going to link my review video over here for Vittorio the Vampire if you want all the details that I could remember at the time of recording that one. But what it comes down to is primarily how the book treated sexual assault of the titular protagonist. And I wasn't fond of how it was dealt with. I didn't remember anything about it from when I originally read the book as a teenager, so I don't know if it was something I just glossed over, or I just didn't register, or I just don't remember. But yeah, it's definitely a bit more of a problematic book than I remember. By the end of the book, the character does realize that he was taken advantage of, and okay, fine, but for a big chunk of the book, even though he doesn't want it, after he is assaulted, he somehow misconstrues it as love for most of the book, and I'm like, that's not cool, guys. Just no, that's not cool. And especially since this takes place in Renaissance Italy, and Vittorio, although considered an adult, is a teenager. He was, what, maybe 16 years old? If I might be stretching it a little bit, but like, yeah. For the next book I'm about to talk about, it's The Tale of the Body Thief, yet another book by Anne Rice. This should not be surprising for anyone who's been here for a while, because I've been reading Anne Rice most of this year. The Tale of the Body Thief was the first book that came after The Queen of the Damned in the Vampire Chronicles timeline. And the first 3 books in the series were really well written. I enjoyed Interview with the Vampire. I really love The Vampire Lestat. It's in one of my top books of all time. And The Queen of the Damned was good, just not as good as the previous 2. So I was hoping The Tale of the Body Thief would be decent. Unfortunately, even on a second read-through, that wasn't the case, at least not for me. There is a few different things that I wasn't fond of. Particularly, there is a very brief rape scene earlier on in the book. There is also another sex scene later on that feels kind of thrown in there. Again, most of the details will be in a review video in the corner if you haven't checked it out already. And it also seemed to ignore a lot of the character development that Lestat had gone through in The Queen of the Damned. It didn't feel like he learned anything, if it makes any sense. That was just my interpretation of it, of course. And there were some things that did come around by the end of the book, but the one reason why I rated this book 2 stars and not 1 star was mostly due to the character development of David Talbot, who was a character who was introduced in The Queen of the Damned as just like a side character, but becomes a major character in The Tale of the Body Thief, and it did a very good job with his character development, and the events of The Tale of the Body Thief do tie into that character's overall development in the series. So I do give the book credit for that, but in most other ways, The Tale of the Body Thief doesn't really hold a candle to the books that came before it. Alright, now we're to the 1-star books. And the first of the 1-star books is yet another Anne Rice book, and that is Medlock the Devil. Again, I've done a review video if you want to check it out over here. This book, I feel, would have been much better off if it was just its own thing and not connected to the Vampire Chronicles. And quite simply, it felt out of place to me. And there's a lot of people who are very passionate about the book, who have been like, oh, you're wrong, it's not this, it's this, blah, blah, blah. That's your interpretation of the book, and I respect that. My interpretation of the book is that it should have been its own separate Christian fiction novel, and I don't feel like it worked in a lot of ways. And again, it felt to me like it ignored some of Lestat's character development. I am intrigued by Anne Rice's interpretation of God and the angels and the creation and Jesus and stuff like that. But to me, it felt out of place in the Vampire Chronicles, and I read the Vampire Chronicles to read vampire books, to read vampire shenanigans, lots of stuff involving vampires, and Medlock the Devil was more just, here is what I think happened with the creation of the world. And I'm just going to put Lestat in there because he's the protagonist of the series. That's it. That's what it is. And if it was any other book, it would have been fine. And, you know, Anne Rice did go on to do more of her own separate Christian fiction novels, which I'm sure are enjoyed by a lot of people. It just didn't feel to me like it had a place in the Vampire Chronicles. That's all. If it wasn't for that, I would have probably given it 2 stars or 3 stars, perhaps. But yeah. Now, I know I breezed through those first 3 books, but because I already reviewed those in their own videos, I didn't want to go into too much detail. This last book, however, this is my first time discussing this book on this channel at all, so you can consider this video to be the review for that. And that is Forever 51 by Pamela Sjoelsvik, I believe. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that name. It is a self-published novel that I had the privilege of reading an ARC, or Advanced Reader copy, off of NetGalley for free a few months ago. And so Forever 51 follows Veronica. So she's basically been 51 years old for just over 100 years because her daughter, who was turned into a vampire, turned her into a vampire. Alright, so she's been getting her blood mostly by working in a senior's residence. And then as they're about to die, you know, she takes their blood for herself. So she gets randomly contacted on Facebook by her daughter one day and learns that there is a way to cure vampirism. So she travels to, I don't even remember where in the United States that she goes to from where she was at. But she meets up with her daughter, and her daughter does this one thing and gives her her soul back. And her daughter therefore becomes human because her mother was the only person she turned into a vampire, okay? I'm not going to say what this thing is because it is a spoiler. There is a written review for the book that I have on Goodreads. I also have a version of that review on the Storygraph. I believe I put it up there. And the actual spoiler itself is in a spoiler tag. So if you want to view it, you can click it for yourself. But Veronica, from that point onward, spends the rest of the book essentially traveling around the US and finding all the people that she turned into a vampire over the century to do this same thing so they can have their souls back and so she can become human. She can't become fully human until she does this. And that's more or less the book. This book had a unique concept with it in how it chose to deal with vampirism in a couple of ways. I'm not going to go over those because they could potentially be considered spoilers. But it kind of felt like the method through which the protagonist, Veronica, was going through in order to become mortal again. To me, it felt like it needed some kind of additional explanation because there is no real understanding as to whether vampirism is caused by, like, a disease or, like, a possession or magic or whatever. There's no real understanding of it. There are very particular ways you do become a vampire, but you don't know exactly what the original source is. The fact that you could do just this one thing and give someone their soul back so they become mortal, and in the process, if you do that to everyone you've done that to, you then become mortal. It implies something magic, but there's nothing there to kind of to be a background explanation. Do you understand what I'm trying to say about that here? One other thing that I wasn't too fond of is Veronica does this despite what those other people she turned into a vampire really think. At least one of those people, like, she does this thing. And that person becomes mortal, and they're like, what the hell? I wanted to be a vampire. And it's just like, okay, so she ignores this person's wish and does this thing to make him mortal so she can become mortal, but he didn't want to be mortal. That was completely ignoring the desires of someone else just so she could become mortal again. That didn't sit well with me. And then possibly the biggest thing I wasn't fond of with this book, and the single biggest reason for me ranking it 1 star, is the type of genre this book falls into. Because just because it has vampires in it, like, this is not a horror novel, okay? This book is written like it's women's fiction, aka chick lit. And I stay away from chick lit books usually because they're written in a way that really, really grates on my nerves. Like, you have these women and these people talking about fashion and about relationships and this and that. Kind of like when you're out in public and you're overhearing nearby conversations, and there's always this one group of women who are talking really annoyingly and about all this stuff that is so fucking boring, but they're nearby so you hear it anyway, and it's just like, that to me is what women's fiction seems like. And the moment I realized what it was, women's fiction is not my thing. It is so not my thing. And I probably would have enjoyed this book a lot better if it was written for a different genre. But women's fiction, if you're into that, you will probably really like this book, and you'll think it's fucking hilarious because it does have a very particular type of humor to it. Which is the other thing, is that the humor in this book is not my type of humor at all. A lot of things that probably would have made someone else chuckle, I read those lines and I'm like, okay, what was the point of this? Like, I literally didn't get it. I don't know if the brand of humor in this book is a particular brand for women's fiction, or it's just this particular author's type of humor that they like. But just like the writing style, it did not sit well with me at all. And the final thing about Forever 51 that I really, really wasn't a fan of was this cover. The cover of this book screams self-pub, and it is a self-published book. But don't think I'm going ham on it just because it's self-pub. I plan on self-pubbing myself. But this cover... Why would you buy a book with this cover? Like, a cover is your biggest selling point for your book. And, like, look at this. Look at this. There's like nothing here. This. Would you buy a book with this cover? Like, legitimately, would you buy a book with this cover? I know I wouldn't. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm collecting vampire fiction and will eventually have it on my shelf as a result, I would not buy this book. But yeah, there you go. These are the 4 books that I read this year that I really wasn't a fan of for one reason or another. I would like to hear what books you read this year that you really weren't too fond of. I'm really curious, and it doesn't have to be vampire fiction. Like, you literally can, like, any book you just didn't like, you can just comment and tell me about if you wish. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching this video today, and I will talk to you later. Bye!